Welcome to the Joy of Genealogy, or should I say, welcome back if you've been following this. I'm so happy that you're here. Thank you for watching and supporting. It's been really awesome to go through this whole process the way I've been doing it. It's just a really cool way to study scripture, and it's scripture that gets skipped. So if you've never seen my video, that's the whole point. The point of the Joy of Genealogy is for us to slow down and just read as much text as we possibly can. Today's video, I'm going to try to do it justice, but it's a lot of scripture and I want to hit the highlights. So let me go ahead and get you started here in Genesis chapter 20. We left off in Genesis chapter 19 last time, talking about Lot and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and we got all the way to the Moabites. Today's video, we are going to move forward, and we're going to talk primarily about Milcah. Milcah is the daughter of Haran and the wife of Nahor. If that is confusing to you, wait until you see the map. Ta-da! I've worked really hard on this map, and I'm pretty sure you can tell that a lot of these lines overlap. But we are basically here. We covered Lot last time. We're going to get into Isaac, and then we'll get into Rebekah. But today we're going to talk about Milcah and Bethuel and their line and how they end up creating the line for Rebekah, who ends up marrying Isaac, who has Jacob, who is the father of the 12 tribes. So if the lines confuse you, here's a chart. I'll put a link to it in the bottom in the description. But for now, this is a general outline, a map, if you will, of where we're going to go. So I'll be your guide as we go through scripture and try to summarize the following tons and tons of passages. So follow along with me like always. Genesis chapter 20 is a callback to the previous story where Abraham told Sarah to tell Pharaoh that she was his sister. And then Pharaoh tried to take her to wife, and he got plagued, and he let her go. Same thing happens with Abimelech, king of Gerar. Now, the interesting thing about this chapter, mostly narrative, again, talking about what I just said, where Abraham tells Abimelech, Sarah's his sister, Abimelech tries to take her to wife, and then gets cursed. But I found verse 12 particularly fascinating. Abimelech confronts Abraham in verse 10. Abimelech said unto Abraham, what sawest thou that thou hast done this thing? And by this thing, he means lie to me and tell me that she was your sister when she's actually your wife. I tried to marry her. God sent curses. Why have you done this? Verse 11. And Abraham said, because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, that they will slay me for my wife's sake. Verse 12. And yet indeed, she is my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. That is a fancy way of saying they're half siblings. Sarah and Abraham are half siblings. I don't know about you. I had no idea. Chapter 21 is about the conception of Isaac in Abraham's old age, the promised seed. Now, I was really tempted to call this video Ishmael Part 2, because I didn't cover this chapter when I was talking about Ishmael, and I wish that I had. Since we're here, Isaac has a feast the same day that he's weaned, and Hagar's son, Ishmael, which we talked about, mocks Isaac. And so Sarah asks Abraham to send Ishmael out. And Abraham is grieved because of his son. So Ishmael's a son too, and they're mocking each other, and Sarah's like, get rid of Ishmael. And that grieves Abraham. God said, let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad, and because of thy bondwoman. For in all that Sarah has said unto thee, hearken unto her voice, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And also of the son of the bondwoman will I make a nation, because he is thy seed. That nation is the Ishmaelites. which we've also talked about. They will come back up in scripture later. But for now, Ishmael gets sent out of the camp, and the Lord, in the end of this chapter, does an awesome provisionary thing. He basically sends Hagar into the wilderness, and in the wilderness of Beersheba, she's afraid that her son is going to die. But God heard the voice of the lad, and the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said unto her, What aileth thee, Hagar? Fear not, for God hath heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him in thine hand, for I will make him a great nation. Again, the Ishmaelites. So that's what happens at the end of the story of Ishmael. Beersheba will come up in play later. And the only other thing you really need to know about 21, just for our purposes, is that Abraham sojourned in the land of the Philistines, which we've talked about before. They are not God's chosen people, but that is where Abraham dwells for many days. Chapter 22. Chapter 22 is also one of those incredible chapters. There's so much teaching on this. I'm sure most people have heard of the story of Abraham being told to sacrifice Isaac. There's so much imagery. It's incredible. The really cool thing is if you take chapter 21 and you compare it to chapter 22 with how God treats Ishmael and how God treats Isaac, that's kind of the entire point. I know I talk about the line of 3, but in this case, it's a line of 2, Ishmael versus Isaac. But if you're going to read chapter 22, which I highly recommend you do, compare it with chapter 21. I was very tempted to make a video on that, but again, I just kind of wanted to move forward genealogically. So chapter 22 is the potential sacrifice of Isaac. God comes through in the last minute and takes Isaac off of the altar, provides a ram. It's a picture of Christ. It's beautiful. It's incredible. We get down to the end of chapter 22, which is where I want to stop for a second for genealogical purposes. We're talking about Milcah. I can't promise this, but when you talk about Genesis chapter 22, this top part is what people talk about, which makes sense. It's a really important story. How many people do you think even know that this is in there? I wouldn't blame them. I'm really not, for saying Genesis 22, the sacrifice of Isaac, but also the line of Milcah, which is really important. So we're going to slow down and talk about that for a second. Verse 20. And it came to pass after these things that it was told Abraham, saying, Behold, Milcah, she hath borne children unto thy brother Nahor. Buz, his firstborn, and Buz, his brother. I know it's kind of funny, cousin Buzz. Kemuel, I cheated, the father of Aram. I'm going to put Aram over here. We may or may not talk about him later. But really, the only person you have down here is Isaac. So essentially, I can do that. All of these are siblings too. Let me denote that the way I typically do. Here. This is the line of Milcah. Try my best to keep things in perspective so that you kind of know who's who. It gets a little confusing, I understand. So we're going to do some symbols to try to keep it straight for you. Verse 22. Chesed is how my audio Bible says that. And Azo, Ildash, Kidlash, Bethuel. I'm saying Bethuel, but Bethuel works also. Bethuel is really important, so we are going to note, do a number sign. Bethuel, verse 23, Bethuel begat Rebekah. These 8 Milcah did bear to Nahor, Abraham's brother. His concubine, I'm going to do it this way, and hopefully it doesn't confuse you. If it does, you can always request these documents and kind of tweak it and do it yourself. But for now, hopefully this doesn't mess you up. If I put Reumah, his concubine, in purple down here, that will denote her lineage using this one. So verse 24, and his concubine, whose name was Reumah, sorry, the audiobook calls her Ruma. She has Sheba and Daham, Tahash, Maacah. Now, these are all in black because I'm assuming they're all male. I can't be sure, but in general, this is Nahor's concubine. This is Haran's daughter. This is Nahor and Milcah's children. These 8 Milcah did bear to Nahor. Now, they're going to be really important, but basically the most important for our purposes is going to be Bethuel, who has Rebekah, who marries Isaac. 2 more chapters for this video, and then I will call it the day. Chapter 23, Sarah dies in Hebron in the land of Canaan, which should sound really familiar to you because we talked about Canaan a lot. One thing I want to point out in this particular chapter is the children of Heth. Now, if you request these documents, which I recommend you do, you can do a Control F and search Heth. So if a name sounds familiar to you, you can figure out why. Heth, the children of Heth, are these people, and they are from the land of Canaan. They are Canaanites. They are not God's chosen people. This is why it's black, because I put them under the line of the cursed people of the Bible. So yeah, if you're ever studying scripture, you can always Control F and see where you know people's names. I didn't really get a chance to study places yet, and I really want to, so maybe in the way future I do that. But for now, I also like to point out places when I can. Beersheba is a big deal in this chapter as well. But for the purposes of our video, Sarah is buried in the land of Canaan. And the sons of Heth, who are Canaanites, who we have talked about before. Chapter 24. Chapter 24 is the last chapter I want to cover today. It's a really interesting, very important narrative about how Rebekah, spoiler alert, ends up married to Isaac. A lot of prophecy, a lot of symbolism, a lot of narrative, and essentially Abraham decides he doesn't want Isaac marrying a Canaanite. As we just said, he's living with the Canaanite people. He left the Philistine people. Now he's living with the Canaanites. That's where Sarah is buried. In this chapter, Abraham seeks to find a wife for Isaac that is not a Canaanite. So he sends a servant to go find one, and they went into the city of Nahor. Why does that sound familiar? Maybe because it's this guy. Not 1,000% sure, but I'm pretty sure it's the same person. I think they even mentioned that in an earlier chapter of Genesis where they named the city after him. But basically, he sends a servant there to look for a wife for Isaac. The servant asks for a sign in chapter 14 at the well. He says, "Pray thee that I may drink," and she shall say, "Drink, and I will give thy camels drink also." So that's the sign that he's looking for to confirm that this is the one that God has chosen for Isaac. So a damsel, very fair to look upon, a virgin, neither had man known her, went down to the well, filled her pitcher, and said, "Drink." And she hastened, let down her pitcher upon her hand, and gave him to drink. Wells are a big deal in the Bible. Most people know that. They're bigger symbolism than I even have time to get into, but there is a well here. It is important. And basically, at this point, the servant says, "Whose daughter art thou? Tell me, I pray thee. Is there a room in thy father's house for us to lodge?" Verse 47, I asked her, whose daughter art thou? And she said, the daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, whom Milcah bare unto him. He put an earring upon her face and bracelets upon her hand. And she is the sister of Laban. Now, Laban is really important later in the story also. So this is the second time. This is the first time, but there are two times in which Laban comes into play when marrying people off. I won't spoil it. A lot of people know, but if you don't, stick around and you'll see Laban come back a second time trying to marry off a female. But at this point, he sees the jewels that the servant gave, and he is greedy as all get out. I mentioned him before. He's a terrible person. Rebekah's father and her brother decide to give Rebekah to Isaac to marry. And they ate, they drank, they tarried all night. Her father and her mother, who I don't think I ever actually get a name, I could be wrong, but Laban and Rebekah's mom, Milcah is her grandmother, said, let the damsel abide with us a few days, at least 10. After that she shall go. And the servant said unto them, hinder me not, saying, the Lord hath prospered my way. Send me away that I may go to my master. And they said, we will call the damsel and inquire at her mouth. And they called Rebekah and said unto her, wilt thou go with this man? And she said, I will go. And they sent away Rebekah, their sister, and her nurse, and Abraham's servant, and his men. And they blessed Rebekah and said unto her, thou art our sister, be thou the mother of thousands of millions, and let thy seed possess the gate of those which hate them. She's going to be the grandmother of the 12 tribes of Israel. So she's kind of a big deal too. Rebekah arose and her damsels, and they rode upon the camel and followed the man. And the servant took Rebekah and went his way. And Isaac came from the way of the well. I didn't look up how to say that. I've said a word very similar to that, but Lehorai, total guess. And he dwelt in the south country. And Isaac went out to meditate in the field at the eventime, and he lifted up his eyes and saw, and behold, the camels were coming. And Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she lighted off the camel. For she had said unto the servant, what man is this that walketh in the field to meet us? And the servant had said, it is my master. Therefore she took a veil and covered herself. And the servant told Isaac all things that he had done. And Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent, and took Rebekah, and she became his wife. And he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. This is such a beautiful picture. I couldn't help but picture a servant leading a wife to her husband, and it just brought back images of Christ. There's a veil, there's this excitement, and she's meeting her husband for the first time, and it just looks to me like a picture of Christ. And that's really where I want to end the video, by saying God provided Isaac a wife outside of the Canaanite people, and God kind of saved her from Laban. There's a little bit of detail in there where you get the idea that Laban is conniving, and his servant's like, let me take her now and not wait 10 days. But it's just such a beautiful picture, and I want that to stick in your mind more than anything else. So I hope you will join me next time, and we will go further into the story.